Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin friends and Formula One fans in the late evening or early morning here from Qatar. The practice and qualifying day is behind us. There was a lot going on and Lance Stroll definitely provided the scenes of the day. Not on the track, but then off it. In qualifying he was eliminated early on in Q1 in P17. Fernando Alonso, who once again fared much better than his teammate, was able to compete with the top teams for the first time in a long time, and his teammate was correspondingly unhappy. Out of the car, his own physiotherapist stood in his way when he left the garage. He was then pushed aside relatively rudely, so that is not proper. I don't think we need to scandalize the scene as much as some people are doing. But that has already shown he has really freaked out, has pushed him to the side. That didn't suit him so well in the interviews afterwards. Friday is not necessarily the most media-friendly day on such a sprint weekend. There are no real media sessions for us. F1 TV has access to the drivers, but those are mostly PR interviews, so relatively little is said there. Lance Stroll, however, gave free rein to his emotions there as well. He used a lot of swear words and said relatively little overall. It shows that he still has emotions, because some people have already suggested that his heart would no longer be in Formula One. The emotions are still there, but they were certainly diverted into the wrong direction after this qualifying. Of course, what he did to his own physiotherapist really wasn't appropriate. Max Verstappen was also summoned before the stewards for such an action against Esteban Ocon. In that case, nothing happened, but of course it's unpleasant. The question that arises is Lance Stroll still acceptable? Not because of this little assault, but rather because of the sporting situation. Fernando Alonso, his teammate, occupies 4th place in the Drivers' World Championship with 174 points. Lance Stroll has 47 points. If we look at the last 7 weeks of racing, that's 43 points for Fernando Alonso, 3 points for Lance Stroll. The trend is your friend, and if you look at the qualifying performance in the last 4 Grand Prix, Lance Stroll was in P20 twice, while also having a really bad accident so that he could not even start the race in Singapore, and then now twice in P17. The big question that naturally arises with Lance Stroll is what will happen to Aston Martin. Because Lance Stroll is, if you like, the project of his father Lawrence Stroll, and he only started this Aston Martin project in order to have something for his son after it did not go forward at Williams, and therefore there are already voices in the paddock who believe that Aston Martin could be sold. So I'm curious, it can't go on like this with Lance Stroll. At least now he has shown emotions and has shown that he cares. Recently it looked more like he really wasn't very competitive and didn't really care. Now he was not competitive, but at least he did care. I also watched him a bit after qualifying. While the whole team was still in the debrief, he was sitting lonely and abandoned in the hospitality in the corner and at something. It's not nice to watch, and I can imagine that it won't go that well for a long time. It really hurts a bit, I'm not the biggest fan of Lance Stroll because of his performance, but it does hurt to watch the whole thing like this. I can't imagine that this will really go on for much longer. Yesterday I touted our new print issue number 93 to you with the beautiful title page of Max Verstappen, but we're also taking care of the problem children in this issue, and that includes Lance Stroll, of course. We anticipated that well, but there are even more troubled drivers. If you want to know who all belongs to it, get our new print edition. You can find the link in the video description. That was, if you will, one phase. The other phase, which then took place on, well actually if you look at it closely, off the track as well, was Tack Limits. A tiresome topic, and at first it looked as if Max Verstappen had qualified on pole once again, and behind him a decent performance from both McLarens once again. Lando Norris in 2nd position, Oscar Piastri in 4th, but with Norris we were relatively quickly sure that there was a track limit situation going on. He had already missed the first attempt in the Q3, and in the second one you could actually see it, but race control took a bit until they had deleted his lap. Then Oscar Piastri moved up 1 position. He was already at the interviews, and then his lap time was also deleted and he also fell back. He is on position 6 now. Lando Norris is in position 10. Norris castigated himself, said, well, it's all his own fault. And it is. I mean, in the end, you can do it quite easily. You can stay within the white line. Nevertheless, of course, this is not as intended, not in the spirit of the sport. It is slowly becoming a real problem. We discussed it for a relatively long time after qualifying, but what happens now? Are there still further offenses that have not yet been punished? What happens in the race? We already had that in Austria when the race was then turned upside down again later on. It can't really go on like that. Then I'm back at the point like with Lance Stroll. In the first free practice, it is now common practice that no track limit violations are penalized in free practice, i.e., the lap times are not deleted. The teams then get a list where you can see the violations. Perhaps it would make sense to monitor it live again during free practice so that you can see a bit more where it could be problematic, but overall you probably have to start at the tracks. We already explained yesterday that MotoGP and Formula One share this circuit, and that during the rebuild it would have been possible to install gravel traps at the track, but the motorcycle riders don't want that, and that's why we ended up with something like this again. That's really anything but good. I'm curious whether it will be a similar chaos in the race as in Austria. But now we finally have to do something. I've already told you there's a special solution that they wanted to try out here, but they haven't dared yet. So we have to try out things like that quickly. We can't have these discussions every few race weekends. It takes the sport ad absurdum. What's on the track? What's great? These beautiful, spectacular laps will be worth nothing in the end. We'll only be discussing things like this. So I heard today that they are experimenting at the Red Bull Ring together with AVL with a solution with which you can monitor violations immediately. That would be a bit of a step up. But you also have to find ways to really punish the drivers if they simply drive over the curbs and not just say, were you over the white line? Yes or no. The big beneficiary of all this track limit discussion or penalties was Mercedes. George Russell has moved up to second position, Lewis Hamilton to third. They had originally qualified in third and fifth, and that's been a decent step forward for Mercedes, including the original positions, because last time out in Japan it was anything but good for Mercedes. The track characteristics probably play a part here too, with lots of fast corners, but the compromise is not so much in demand as in Suzuka. There are no really slow corners at all. If there are any, then they are medium-fast corners, and that means the compromise that hit Mercedes so hard in Japan doesn't really exist here anymore. You can set up the car very low, and there are actually no bumps, and that seems to suit the Silver Arrows a bit better. And what's also a good step for Mercedes is that things are going well for once on a sprint weekend, where they've recently had really big problems with just one practice session to really get into the Parc Fermé conditions with the right setup. That obviously worked out quite well here, and that's why they've actually been quite satisfied even without benefiting from the track limits situation. At Ferrari, it was just the opposite. They'd always done quite well on the sprint weekend so far, but now relatively little has come together. Charles Leclerc only qualified in 7th position. He then moved up to 5th position. He had problems getting the tires into the right working window. Now you think, okay, getting the tires up to temperature on the track at these temperatures, the problem is really the rear axle. It's a track that goes very heavily on the front axle. So the front tires were there right away, but the rear axle wasn't there right away at the start of the lap, and that's why they had problems, especially in turns 4 and 5 with the rear end going away, which is why Ferrari didn't have a lot going for it. Carlos Sainz, who had similar problems, didn't get on at all in free practice either. He then had some problems with track limits on top of that and had to start a new attempt, which is why he actually didn't make it into Q3. It's only grid position 12 for the Spaniard, for the only non-Red Bull winner this season. Incidentally, Sergio Perez fared similarly badly, having his fastest lap in Q2 deleted and once again failing to make it into Q3. It was a different story for his teammate Max Verstappen, so what else is there to say? Pole position. Yes, he made a small mistake on his last attempt, but it was still enough for pole. He can now crown himself world champion in the sprint race on Saturday. Nothing has really changed the situation today, but it's still extremely likely that the World Championship will be decided on Saturday. We've now drawn up the grid for Sunday, so let me say again that tomorrow we can forget everything we've discussed today. Red Bull has apparently found the right setup on the sprint weekend. That's the good news from Max Verstappen's point of view. Saturday will be a completely independent day with probably the championship decision, and then on Sunday you can watch this video again, because then you need to know what the grid looks like for the Grand Prix. And if you want to find the video quickly again, then I recommend you simply subscribe to the channel on YouTube, which costs nothing compared to the print edition, and then you can find this video a little faster and get in the mood before the race.